Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Leader to Leader series. My name is Jeff, and today I'm going to be reviewing a book called Sensemaking: The Power of the Humanities in the Age of the Algorithm. And there's my dog, who's trying to get out of the room, but he can't. He's trapped in here with me. This book, Sensemaking, was written by Christian Madsbjerg, who writes, speaks, and teaches on the practical application of the human sciences and 20th century continental philosophy. He's interested in human worlds, human perception, and the skill of observation, and Christian has taught at the New School for Social Research, is a senior fellow at the Health and Global Policy Institute in Tokyo, Japan, and is a distinguished visitor at the Buffett Center for International Affairs at Northwestern University in Chicago. His work has been featured in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Financial Times, Der Spiegel, and Business Week, and now on Leader to Leader. I really loved Sensemaking. As a matter of fact, in the last Leader to Leader episode, we talked about mind over machine, the power of human intuition and expertise in the era of the computer, and I actually learned about that book through Sensemaking. And I actually didn't remember that until I was reviewing my notes for this video. In my last video, we talked about the levels of novice to expertise, like the 5 levels moving from as you move your skill set from knowledge through proficiency through to expertise. Well, that particular ladder was actually written in Sensemaking, and that's how I found out about mind over machine. I thought it was such a fascinating little insight into how expertise is developed that I ended up buying Mind Over Machine. I completely forgot that that's how I found it. So this book was really impactful for me for a couple of ways. It expanded my mind and led me to Mind Over Machine, which I thought was a fantastic book. And also for the reasons that I'm going to talk about in this video very briefly, which are the 5 principles of sensemaking. So this by no means is a comprehensive review of this topic. It's not meant to be. This is meant to be sort of like a little teaser. And I really do encourage you to go out and buy Sensemaking. Christian just released his latest book called Look in July of this year, so just last month. And I highly recommend you go out and buy that as well. I have purchased it, but I haven't yet read it. I'm really looking forward to it. So in this particular video, I want to talk about the 5 principles of sense making. Okay, so sense making is Madsbjerg's term for using context, environment, history, as all of these different data points to lead to some type of conclusion. And rather than just using sort of discrete or specific data points to drive rationale or reasoning, rather than just that, using a comprehensive array of data points that includes aspects of the humanities. So quite literally, the arts and culture and cultural history to make decisions. And so the 5 principles of sense-making that Madsbjerg talks about are the following. And I'll go into them in a little bit of detail, and I'll share sort of my thoughts and opinions in relevant portions as we move through. So first, culture, not individuals. That's principle number 1. And the idea behind culture, not individuals, is that nothing exists in a vacuum or is discretely disassociated from other things. And a great example that he gives in this book is lipstick is not just a component in a makeup bag. Rather, it's part of a toolkit for beautification. Right? So it's a small part of a whole. If you look at it as a discrete unit, okay, sure, it's like a lipstick, it's rouge, it's got a different, there's different, I was going to say different flavors. There may be, but there are different colors out there, different manufacturers. And yes, the distinct purpose is to color your lips, but from a broader context, it's just one component of a broader toolkit that has a higher order of sort of execution, right? A higher order of meaning. The second principle in sense making is thick data, not just thin data. And thick data describes how things relate to each other in a greater context. So the example that Madsbjerg gives in Sensemaking is the wink of an eye. The thin data interpretation of a wink of an eye is just a momentary twitch lasting a millisecond, right? But it can mean so much more. We all know it means so much more. It can communicate, I'm not serious. It can communicate, let's leave together. It can communicate, you're an idiot. That's thick data, things relating to each other in a greater context. Third principle of sense making, the savannah, not the zoo. So this is a little bit more abstract as a concept, but it makes a little bit more sense when I go into the description of what this actually means. So the savannah, not the zoo. If you really want to understand something about a culture, and this could be a work culture, this could be the culture of a people, of a region, the trick is to see its ghosts, its heritage, its artistic heritage, its history, its customs. This is the difference between lions hunting on the savannah or being fed from a bowl in a zoo, right? You cannot gain an understanding of lion by watching it eat from a bowl in the zoo. The only way you can do that is by seeing lion be lion in the savannah. That's how you get a truer, more comprehensive picture of lionness. And this holds true for organizations as well. I'm sure that many of us have entered an organization and have tried to sort of understand the context, the new context in which we're operating, if it's a new job, or understand the context behind why certain things are the ways that they are. And you can't look at discrete data points and figure those things out. You really sort of have to understand the culture, the history, the customs of the organization. And every organization does have, well, hopefully has some sort of culture, and hopefully that culture is positive. But again, as it pertains to an organization, this is all about culture. And to understand a culture, you have to understand why things were done a certain way, who made things that way, why they made things that way. There's a sort of fuller picture that has to come, has to sort of manifest. The fourth principle of sense making is creativity, not manufacturing. There's a very interesting quote in this book, and it's by American philosopher Charles Saunders Peirce, who said, "Only abductive reasoning can produce new ideas." So abductive reasoning seeks the simplest and most likely conclusion from a set of observations. It seeks a plausible solution, but doesn't definitively verify it. This is different than deductive reasoning, wherein it's impossible for the premise to be true without the conclusion being true as well. So it's not a definitive answer. Instead, it seeks the simplest and most likely conclusion from a set of observations without necessarily moving to proof. And shortly thereafter, Madsbjerg talks about 4 offenses of reasoning. And I think these are really interesting, particularly a couple of them, which I'll talk about in a little bit more depth. One is we make an absolute assertion that we're right? That's one offense of reasoning. We are right. There's a very interesting book that I'll do in a future Leader to Leader called Judgment in Managerial Decision Making. It's a little book, and it's quite dense. But it talks about some cognitive biases. And one of those cognitive biases is the overconfidence fallacy, or the overconfidence bias. The overconfidence bias is this very interesting phenomenon where an individual, the more unsure an individual is about something, the more certain they become about that thing. The more confident they are in describing their feeling about that thing, which is it seems completely incongruous. It's like, it's very dissonant in our minds, right? But that's why it's a logical fallacy. So this overconfidence bias pertains to this first offense of reasoning, which is we make an absolute assertion that we're right. And that's very, very hard to do. The second offense of reasoning is we believe something isn't knowable because we don't have techniques or technologies to figure it out. This is a clear offensive reasoning. This happens all the time in other contexts. I'm not going to get into those other contexts because they're quite controversial and far out of the scope of this series, but it is a fallacy to believe something is not knowable simply because we can't figure it out today. We don't have techniques to measure it. We don't have techniques to discern it. That is certainly an offensive reasoning. The third offensive reasoning is we insist that some element of science is inexplicable and unknowable. So this pertains to the second offense of reasoning, which is believing something isn't knowable because we can't see it or we can't measure it. This is very similar. We believe that some element of science is inexplicable and unknowable. We certainly can't make that assertion for certain, so we shouldn't assume that as a rationale or within our judgment or our decision making, because we simply don't know that that's true. And finally, and this is true in a lot of cases, we believe that some law or truth is in its final or perfect state. And I see that happening all the time. I can relate this very easily to coming into a job, coming into an organization, either as a new hire or a new leader or whatever it may be, and seeing something done a certain way, right? This is the way we've done it. Or, okay, it works, so this works for now, but it may not be in its final or perfect state. It may just be sufficient for now, right? But there are always ways that we can improve upon that. So it's quite dangerous, actually, to believe regularly that something is in its final or perfect state. And finally, the fifth law of sense-making is the North Star, not the GPS. Right? So we must learn to navigate through the rich reality of our world, developing finely honed perspectives on where we are and where we're headed. Facts always live in a context, and hacking them into discrete data points renders them meaningless and incomplete. So if we consider the North Star and not the GPS, we're not necessarily following a predetermined the best route forward, the best predetermined path forward. No, instead, we're learning to navigate through the rich reality of our world. And as we do that, we develop perspectives on where we are. We develop perspectives and routes for where we're headed based on the observations we're making now. And that's a much fuller way to reach a conclusion or our destination, right? So we're following the North Star. We're sort of finding our way along the path. We know the direction that we want to go, but of the 5 paths in front of us, we may not know which one we want to take. And we may jump from one to the other, and we may backtrack a little bit and then move forward. And that's the journey, and that's the excitement of the journey. And that happens all the time. It's very rare that we know exactly how we're going to reach our final destination. More often than not, we are following the North Star. We have a vision, or we have an idea, or we have a picture in mind of what we want to achieve, and we're finding our way to get there. That's the guiding light, and we may not know exactly what steps we have to follow, but we know where we're trying to go, and we're all trying to get there together. And that's really the excitement of the journey. And the last thing I'll talk about in this leader-to-leader episode is what Madsbjerg calls chains of meaning, which I think is such an important thing to remember. Here are the 2 examples. A hammer is a hammer when it's used to build a house, in order to create a shelter, in order to have a home, in order to feel secure. The other example is one drinks coffee, because I'm addicted, but one drinks coffee in order to stay alert, in order to remain productive, in order to be successful, in order to put food on the table. So back to principle number 1 of sense making. Nothing exists in a vacuum. And the example with lipstick is not just a component of a makeup bag, but it's part of a toolkit for beautification. We have to think about things in a broader context. And as it pertains to leadership and organizations, we also have to remember that there is no discrete unit of leadership. There is no discrete leadership trait or skill or talent that exists independently of any other one. Even if there is one of those, it still exists within the environment of the organization, the team, the colleagues, what have you. Even if that skill or trait or talent is a discrete unit, unrelated from anything else, which it's quite impossible for that to be, because the other context is you. So you have developed that in your own way, and it bears your stamp and your traits, and your unique fingerprint. So really, even that, if there were such a thing as a discrete trait, particularly in leadership, it's like I couldn't even imagine one. But regardless, these all exist within the broader context of an organization. So it's important to remember that nothing really happens in a vacuum. Everything that you're doing, you have to consider the context in which it's operating. And I'll give one quick example. This actually was a real example. It just happened very recently at work. It was last week. And one of my colleagues asked about prioritization, right? With shifting business priorities at work, how do we effectively prioritize? And the discussion was around our organization within my company prioritizing our own work, right? How do we prioritize our own work? And I contributed the following thought to the conversation. It's one thing to be able to prioritize our own work for our own purposes, but a lot of times that work is at the behest of somebody else. We're doing that work for an internal customer. So we can't simply reprioritize our own work and then be done with it because it's helpful for us. We actually have to involve that customer and determine how important is the work that we are reprioritizing to them. So as a very simple example of, nothing existing in a vacuum and everything sort of being interrelated, particularly as it pertains to an organization, I think that's just a pertinent example that just happened very recently. So to sum up, I really, really liked Sensemaking. I'm very excited to read Christian's other books. You can find more of his work online at madsberg.com. I'll put the a little note up there, somewhere up here. And I hope you get it. I hope you read it, and I'll put a link to the book as well up here. And it's a fantastic book. And if you're in the data sciences, if you're in the tech industry, it's just a fascinating read. It's a great way to sort of get your mind out of maybe the mode that you've been in, like looking at data as data all the time, and having some really fascinating and interesting examples of the humanities that and how they apply to creating products. There's a fascinating example in here I won't get into about how a car company created a new car based on some of the humanities data that the car company went out and collected from a particular region. I thought it was such a great example, but I will leave it to you. I really encourage you to get the book. I really hope you enjoy it. Please like and share this video if you found it helpful or entertaining. I'd love to also hear from you in the comments. Thank you so very much.